you ever met someone who was just unlucky? I mean, someone who just couldn't catch a break? This is Walter Summerford. And Walter Summerford was an English officer in the early 1900s. And Walter had the interesting life experience to have been struck by lightning not once, not twice, but 3 times. 3 times he was struck by lightning. In fact, he must have loved lightning so much that even after he died, his tombstone was struck by lightning too, and it was destroyed. Now this is a picture of John Lynn, and John was known by the name Calamity John. John had 16 major accidents in his life, from lightning strikes to a rock fall in a mine to 3 different car crashes. In fact, one time as a child, he was in a horse and carriage and he fell off the horse and carriage, and if that wasn't bad enough, he got run over by the delivery man. Very, very unlucky guy. Now this is a picture of Ron Wayne. And you might recognize the 2 people on either side of him. That's right, Ron Wayne helped start Apple. But in 1976, he just couldn't stand working with Steve Jobs, and so he sold his shares in Apple for $800. Today, if he had just held on to his stock would have been worth today $27 billion. Couldn't catch a break. Now, do you know who this person is? His name is Kyle Craven. Does anybody want to take a guess at why Kyle is famous? Well, when Kyle was in the 7th grade, his principal made him take his school picture again because he thought that Kyle was intentionally making a face when he took his first picture. Well, a few years ago, someone got their hands on that 7th grade school picture and started publishing a meme known as Bad Luck Brian. Now, in the Bad Luck Brian memes, on the top half is something good or cool or some situation that Brian finds himself in, and then on the bottom half it shows that Brian just can't catch a break. So for example, there's this one, calls 911, gets their voicemail. Or this, fortune cookie says, you'll have long life, chokes to death on fortune cookie. Plans own birthday party, still isn't invited. Parents get divorced, no one wants custody. And this one I think is hilarious. Escapes burning building, gets hit by fire truck. Brian just can't catch a break. Now these are bad stories. These are stories of really, really unlucky people. But to me, the worst stories are the ones where the person is on top of the world. They've got everything going for them, and then they lost it all because they had it all. This is William Post. In 1988, William Post won $16.2 million in the Pennsylvania lottery. Years later, he would find himself living on Social Security. William said, "I wish it never happened. It was a total nightmare." After he won his winnings, his former girlfriend sued him for a share of the winnings. His brother was arrested for hiring a hitman to kill him, hoping that he would inherit some of his winnings. William ended up doing some jail time for shooting at a money collector. Listen, less than a year after he won, less than a year, he was $1 million in debt. And he admitted he was both careless and foolish, and he was trying too hard to please his family. Eventually, William would declare bankruptcy. He eventually was living quietly on $450 a month in Social Security and food stamps. In an interview, he said, "I'm tired. I'm over 65 years old, and I just had a serious operation for a heart aneurysm. Lotteries don't mean anything to me. And in 2006, he died of respiratory failure. For William, winning actually cost him everything. But he's not the only one. We've been in this series, Facing Your Giants, where we've been talking about the life of the most famous giant killer of all, a man named David, who was one of the kings of ancient Israel. And when David was going through his life and experiencing his life, he wrote down much of the feelings that he had when he was going through the things that he was going through. Imagine for a minute, David was only 15 years old when God had the prophet Samuel anoint him as the next king of Israel. And that was good news for David. It was a promising future for him. He had it all, and then he loses it all. Winning cost him everything. In fact, what we're going to see is that winning costs you everything when you go from hero to zero in a matter of moments. Look at the life of David. David starts off by defeating Goliath, right? And Goliath was a giant. He was a Philistine, one of the members of the army that was coming against Israel. Goliath was from the town of Gath, and David met him on the battlefield one-on-one as a young boy, 15 years old, and killed him. And then David becomes a high-ranking officer in Saul's army because God was with David. And so David was successful in battle. And because of that, David becomes the most popular person in Israel, even more popular than the king. In fact, one day, the Israelite army is returning from battle, and the people are celebrating their victory, and they're dancing around the army, and they're singing the song, Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And that's when it all changed. Because one by one, all of those things that David had been given were stripped away. David lost his job. He went from shepherd to the king's musician to warrior, the most successful warrior in the king's army. And because he got that success, the king became jealous of him. And so, what happens? King Saul tries to kill David. It talks about how Saul one day is just throwing spears at him. And then David loses his job. He loses his income. He loses his security. And he will never serve in Saul's army again. David loses his wife. You see, David was married to the king's daughter, Michal. And Saul had sent soldiers to kill him, but Michal helps him escape. And Saul's upset about that. And so Saul takes Michal back, and Michal ends up marrying someone else. Not only did David lose his wife, he also lost his mentor. In fact, when he was running from Saul, David would go to the city of Ramah, where Samuel lived. Samuel was his spiritual mentor. Samuel was the one that anointed David king. Samuel was the one that assured David that God's presence would be in his life. God spoke to David through Samuel. And so David knew that if he could get to Samuel, he would be safe there. But instead, Saul hears that David is going to Ramah. And so he sends soldiers to Ramah to get him. And so David has to escape again. But Samuel, his friend, his mentor, is too old to go with him. And so David has to go alone. And not long afterwards, Samuel would die. So David loses his wife. He loses his mentor. And then David loses his best friend. Because David would run to his best friend Jonathan, who happened to be the son of the king. And Jonathan stood up to his father, and he risked his life for David. But Jonathan couldn't, or he wouldn't, raise a sword against his father. And Jonathan, as much as he wanted to, would not leave the king's court. And so David had to go off and run for his life again. His job ended in failure. His marriage ended in failure. His mentor died. His best friend was out of his life. But then it gets worse. David actually runs to the only place that he could think of to get away from everybody. He goes to Gath, the the Goliath's hometown. He actually goes to the home of his mortal enemies because he has nowhere else to go. And that didn't work out any better for him, and so he was on the run again. Scripture records it like this. It reads, "So David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam." See, winning had cost David everything. He had wealth, power, fame, friends, security, and what he thought was a guaranteed future. He was going to be the king. But now he was running for his life, and he was living in a cave, the cave of Adullam. One author would call it the cave named failure. Now, this is a picture of a cave. There's several caves in this area where the caves of Adullam are. And this is a picture of the outside of one of the caves. You can see it's just like a door built into the side of a mountain. And this is what it looks like from the inside. You see, the cave is where you end up when everything holding you up, everything lifting you up is stripped away. The cave is where you find yourself when you thought things were going to be great, when you thought you were going to do great things, when you thought you were going to have a great family, when you set out to change the world, to boldly go where no one has gone before. But then you look around and you realize that things haven't worked out the way you dreamed they would. So maybe you're in the cave because of your bad decisions, or maybe you're in the cave because of circumstances that you couldn't control. Maybe it's a combination of those two. Maybe you're in a cave right now. Maybe because you lost your job and now you're under extreme financial pressure. Maybe the dreams about your family life have been shattered. Maybe you've lost your mentor. Maybe you've lost your best friend. Maybe the relationship that you thought you could count on is now gone. Maybe you've been let down. Maybe you've been betrayed. Maybe it's some physical condition that is limiting you from doing all that you want to do. Or maybe it's that you simply find yourself alone. For whatever reason, you are in a cave. And if you're not, here's the thing, you just have to wait, because sooner or later, every one of us spends some time in the cave. And one of the hardest things about being in the cave is that we start thinking that God has forgotten about us, that God has forgotten about His promises to us. Like maybe those promises were for other people, but they certainly weren't for me, or I wouldn't be in this cave. And we start to think, is this all I'm ever going to be in this cave? Am I going to die in this cave? And I hope that you will keep this one thing in mind. The cave is where God does some of His best work in molding and shaping our lives and our character. Because sometimes when everything else is stripped away, and all you have is God, you come to realize that all you need is God. And sometimes when we get to these places, when our worst fears about our inadequacy, of our shortcomings, of our failures, when they are confirmed, and we discover that we really are in way over our head, that there is a feeling of liberation that happens when we know that it's okay to not be enough. It's okay for us to have our weaknesses exposed, because God's power flows best through our weaknesses. Sometimes the cave is where you meet God. For many of us, the cave is where God does His best work on us, in us, and eventually through us from what happens while we are in the cave. So what should I do? What should we do when winning has cost us everything? What should we do when we find ourselves in the cave? There are two psalms, which are simply songs or poems that were written, we know were written by David while he was on the run from Saul, while he was hiding out in the cave of Adullam. It's Psalm 57 and Psalm 142. And in these two Psalms, David teaches us what we should do when we are in the cave. So what should I do when I've lost everything? The first thing we have to do is this: be honest with God about how I'm feeling. Because here's the secret, and it's not really that big of a secret. God already knows how you're feeling. He's God. There's no benefit to being fake with God about your emotions. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've asked someone how they're doing because I can tell by the look on their face, by the way that they are carrying themselves, that something is going on. And they'll talk about how they're late on their mortgage, or the car needs new brakes, or the kids are having problems at school. I mean, they're clearly in the cave. But then they'll say something like, but praise God, He's still in control. Well, yeah, I know that. I'm not asking you how God is. I'm asking you how you are. Listen to what David says when he is in the cave. David says, I cry out to the Lord. I plead for the Lord's mercy. I pour out my complaints before Him and tell Him all my troubles. See, David doesn't hide what's going on from God. God already knows. What does he do? He cries out to God. He pleads with God. He pours out to God. He tells God. And he doesn't start like you see sometimes with these very formal introductions to his prayer. Oh, great and mighty God of the universe, the creator of all things. You know, he doesn't start like that. Because that's not really how we communicate. If I was talking to my father when my father was still alive, if I wanted to talk to my father, I wouldn't say, oh, great Father who created me and gives me sustenance and a place to live. I would just say, hey, this is what's going on right now. And that's what David does. He goes right to God and he jumps right in. He tells Him all his troubles. And all means all. All means anything and everything. Here are a few things that David says we can be honest with God about. He says we can be honest with God. I can be honest with God about my fears. In Psalm 142, David says, when I'm overwhelmed, You alone know the way I should turn. See, I don't have to worry about God because God knows when I'm fearful. I can be honest with Him about it. David says that I can be honest with God about my drama. He writes, wherever I go, my enemies have set traps for me. Now, is it really everywhere he goes? Or is he having one of those moments like we all do where it just feels like it's closing in from everywhere because it feels overwhelming because we really can't process it because it's coming at us so fast, but it's not literally everywhere. David says you can take that to God. And David says you can be honest about your loneliness. Because sometimes when you're in the cave, you are alone. Even when you're surrounded by people, you still feel alone. And listen to what David writes. He says, I look for someone to come and help me, but no one gives me a passing thought. No one will help me. No one cares a bit about what happens to me. So what should you do when you find yourself in the cave? The first thing you need to do is to be honest with God about how you're feeling. The second thing to do is to remember that God has a purpose for cave. He has a purpose for caves. See, God uses everything in your life, good and bad, and everything in between, to fulfill His purpose for your life. God wants to grow you through your pain because He knows that in your pain, so much growth can happen. And it's often in our pain that we become prepared for the greater things that God has in store for us. And the reality for a lot of us is that sometimes God has to allow us to be broken down so that He can build us back up the right way. So that He can come and heal us the right way. David would write it this way. He would say, I cry out to God Most High, to God who will fulfill His purpose for me. You see, David is in the cave. He's crying out to God. But David knows that God has a purpose for his time in the cave. And so David doesn't sulk about it. He knows he's in the cave, but he keeps moving forward. He keeps pressing on. What's the third thing to do when I'm in the cave? It is to place my confidence in God and not in my circumstances. We don't have slides for this, but I just want to read this. It is 1 Samuel 24, starting in verse 1. After Saul returned from fighting the Philistines, he was told that David had gone into the wilderness of En-Gedi. So Saul chose 3,000 elite troops from all Israel and went to search for David and his men near the rocks of the wild goats. At the place where the road passes some sheepfolds, Saul went into a cave to relieve himself, but as it happened, David and his men were hiding farther back in that very cave. Now's your opportunity, David's men whispered to him. Today the Lord is telling you, I will certainly put your enemy into your power to do with as you wish. So David crept forward and cut off a piece of the hem of Saul's robe. But then David's conscience began bothering him because he had cut Saul's robe. The Lord knows I shouldn't have done that to my lord the king, he said to his men. The Lord forbid that I should do this to my lord the king and attack the Lord's anointed one, for the Lord himself has chosen him. So David restrained his men and did not let them kill Saul. You see, what David wanted more than anything else was to be free from the cave. He had been on the run from Saul for 7 years, and this was his opportunity to be free from Saul and free from the cave. But deep inside, David knew that God wasn't dealing with him in the cave. God wasn't done with him yet. And so instead of putting his confidence into his circumstances, instead of putting his confidence into his own abilities, David left his confidence in God. David wanted to be king more than anything, but even more than that, well, almost anything. Even more than that, David wanted to belong to God. And David wasn't about to do anything that would jeopardize that. He would rather please God in the cave than displease God and sit on the throne. This is what he would write. He would say, my enemies have set a trap for me, but my heart is confident in you, O God. My heart is confident. No wonder I can sing your praises. So if you're in a cave and you want to know what to do, or if you're not in a cave, but you want to know what to do when you find yourself in the cave, first you have to be honest with God about how you're feeling. You have to remember that God has a purpose for caves. You have to put your confidence in God and not in your circumstances. And lastly, receive God's help even though it might come from an unlikely place. See, David is lost and he's alone and he has nowhere to go. And he ends up in the cave of Adullam, in the middle of nowhere. But he's not alone for long. Listen to what happens. Soon his brothers and all his other relatives joined him there. Then others began coming, men who were in trouble or in debt or who were just discontented, until David was the captain of about 400 men. See, David wasn't the only one in the cave. He wasn't the only one on the run. And David's dysfunctional family shows up on him. I can think of a lot of other people that David might have wanted to be there, but it's his family that shows up. And if that wasn't bad enough, other people came too. People who had gotten themselves into trouble, people who had gotten themselves into serious debt, people who just weren't happy with the way their life was going. 400 of them came to that cave. And all of them looked to David as their leader. Now, this wasn't the kind of help David was hoping for. I mean, none of these guys, had ever read How to Win Friends and Influence People. And this was the group of people who no one wants to sit to at lunch in high school, right? And somehow they all find each other and they all commit to doing life together. So when you're in the cave, God will send you help. It just might not look the way that you thought it would. On the outside, the people that God sent may not look like much. They may not have a lot of influence. They may not have a lot of money. They may not be able to do anything to improve your social status, but what you'll find is that they'll be the best friends that you will ever have. That's why I love our church. That's why I love Gracepoint. Now, I'm not saying that you guys are a bunch of losers. Absolutely not. Far from it. But I can remember a little over 10 years ago, Terry and I had a conversation about the kind of church that we would actually want to attend. The kind of church that we would want to be a part of. A church that valued being real and authentic. A church where you could just come as you are. A church where it was safe to ask the hard questions. Where it was safe to bring your doubts. Where everyone was welcome. Welcome to my cave. And so if you're watching us online today, or if you're here with us live in the house today, and if you come from a church background that says, if you're going to come to church, you have to look like your life is all put together, even if it's not. Or if you think church is supposed to be like this, and church shouldn't be like that, then listen, you just might be watching the wrong broadcast. There are plenty of churches like that you can go to, that you can watch. But this isn't going to be the place that is going to be like that for you. See, as your pastor, I can tell you, although a lot of you already know this, your pastor isn't perfect. And not only will I not try to be that for you, I am going to just love every opportunity that I give you by doing something stupid for you to remind me that I'm not perfect. My wife isn't perfect, though she's perfect for me. I mean, anyone willing to put up with me for 30 years deserves a national holiday. My kids, despite what Terry says, they aren't perfect either. Listen, they're pastors' kids, and they miss church once in a while. Usually off spending time with their friends, going out and doing something cool. So if you're looking for a church where the pastor comes in and he wears a suit and he says hallelujah every other word, where he works real hard at making it look like he's got the perfect family, then you really are in the wrong place. Because this is my cave. And sometimes there's just no way out of the cave. And in those times, all that you can do is find your peace and find your refuge in God. And what you'll come to learn is what I came to learn a long time ago. That God knows all about caves. Because Jesus, who was also known as the Son of David, suffered for us and suffered like us. The Son of David also lost his position. He lost his job and his status as a teacher. He lost his safety and security. He not only lost his best friend, but he lost all of his friends. His life was in danger, and it got worse. He went to a cross and he died, and it appeared to everyone that all of his dreams and all the dreams that he inspired died with him. What started out as a shining success looked like it ended in failure. But then they put his body in a cave. That was their big mistake. His body was there for 3 days, but they couldn't keep him there. They forgot that God does some of his best work in caves. Because the cave is where God resurrects dead things. Listen to me. The cave is where God resurrects dead things. I don't know what cave you're in right now. Maybe it's a lost job. Maybe it's a failed marriage. Maybe it's a child that you love that has disappointed you. Maybe your dreams for your children look as if they're never going to be fulfilled. Maybe it has become apparent that the dreams that you had for your life are never going to come through. Maybe you're not in the cave at all. Maybe you never have been, but listen, you will. Because sooner or later, everyone spends some time in the cave. And so when your time comes, just remember one thing. God does his best work in caves. And if you're in the cave, He is doing His best work on you right now.
Thank you for joining us for this week's message. Gracepoint Church is located in South San Francisco, California. For additional content or to find out more information about Gracepoint Church, visit us online at wearegracepoint.com.